Hello, and welcome to this seminar titled Ethical Considerations and Community Music. In this seminar, we will look at community music practices to spotlight some ethical considerations in informal and non-formal music making and learning, some of which intersect and overlap with the issues you have been exploring already in this module. This seminar will begin with a recap with regards to what do we mean by ethical considerations. We'll then move to an introduction to community music. We'll then consider music being good for you and music being bad for you. We'll look at some ethical considerations in community music that overlap with ethical considerations in music education. And we'll finish up with a discussion of working as boundary walkers. What are the limits and possibilities? You can pause this seminar at any point to make notes, reflect, or write questions that you would like to discuss during your tutorials. Throughout, you're invited to make connections to your own practice by reflecting on how the issues relate or do not relate to your work and why. Before we start, I invite you to take a moment to reflect on what values, beliefs, and aims guide your practice. What is important to you? And how do your values, beliefs, and aims inform what you consider to count as ethical working with others? You can add your responses to Padlet, and you can access Padlet by scanning the QR code that's on screen now or getting the link on the Ethical Considerations module page on Moodle. So these are quite big questions. You might have some answers to them at your fingertips and others might take a bit more reflection time. I know I still reflect on these questions because values and beliefs can be locked inside or taken for granted, and they can have implicit biases in them, so they need unearthing. But I'd like to invite you to pause this seminar now, maybe get a glass of water or a cup of tea and have a go at responding to these questions. Before we start, I think it's worth taking a moment to recap on what we mean by ethical considerations at this point in the module. Broadly, as I understand it, by ethical at its most straightforward, I mean attempting to do what is good or right as a music educator. And this leads to the question, what is good or right? What does, for example, good or right look, feel, or sound like in music education? And how can that be known? And who decides? Here, the question of what counts as good is paramount. As community and cultural practice writer and researcher Francois Matarasso explains, to consider whether something is ethical, we need to define what good is. And I'll just read Matarasso's quote. An arts program cannot be judged good or bad unless the concept of good is defined. Good for what? Good for whom? Good in comparison with what? And I think what Matarasso is explaining is there isn't a one-size-fits-all type of good. Good is contingent. It's dependent on many things in your practice. And as a teacher, as a practitioner, you are an active contributor in deciding what is good in the context of your music education practice. Now, the agency that you have to develop your pedagogies and ways of working in response to what you think is good might differ depending where you work. So if you're a music teacher in a school, for example, where you have very rigid policies and frameworks and curricula that you must adhere to, if your understanding of what is good differs to that, it might be difficult for you to make big changes. You might have to make some small kind of inroads. If you're working as a freelance instrumental teacher, and maybe with less policy to follow, you might be able to make more decisions about the musics that you teach and the way that you teach, depending on and related to what you think is good. And I think this is really what this module is about. It's about giving you space to reflect on your practice, ethical considerations that you meet in your practice or ethical dilemmas, what you think is good, and moving forward with ways to navigate that. So, in short, ethical considerations are situated, context dependent, and nuanced. And I've just showing this quote here from music educators Randall Alsop and Heidi Westerland, because I really like the way that they talk about a situational good embedded in conduct. And we'll go on to explore this through the seminar. For now, I invite you to take a moment to think about what you consider to be good or right in your practice. So you can pause the seminar again and reflect on what you consider to be good or right in your practice. And you might want to return to the Padlet to look at your reflections on beliefs, values, and aims, and think about how those beliefs, values, and aims might inform or shape what you think of as good or right. So let's turn to an introduction to community music. You may be familiar with this or new to it, but I'm going to offer a general overview to ground us in some of the key ideas and to demonstrate that what might be considered as ethical, or how we navigate ethical complexities in community music, is really tied to values and beliefs that flow from the field's foundational principles. So, broadly speaking, community music is a participatory music practice that aims towards positive change of some kind for and with those that take part. And I've been deliberately vague with that positive change of some kind, because through music making with groups and individuals, community musicians might work towards lots of different things, and that's to be decided between those that take part. So they might work towards peace building, enhanced well-being, social cohesion, or supporting the visibility of marginalized groups by creating spaces for them to be heard, or something else. There's a range of potential outcomes there. So this work is enacted between skilled facilitators or music leaders and participants, the individuals and groups they make music with. Notice the term facilitator or leader is used rather than teacher or educator. That's not to say that community musicians don't teach. I, as a community musician, have taught before, a participant in a band for adults in recovery, asked me to teach them music theory, actually, at one moment. So I did that. But really, we use the term facilitator or leader to emphasize that the work is about supporting participants, enabling them in what they want to do and facilitating their music making, rather than, for example, teaching a predefined topic or piece of music. And community music is underpinned by a welcome to all. So in the UK, for example, community musicians may work with school children, people with mental health diagnoses, incarcerated peoples, and others. And I should just note there that I'll be talking about community music today from a UK perspective. There are many other practices in many other countries. I talk about UK community music because that's where my experience lies as a participant, as a facilitator, and as a researcher. So community music has been said to operate at the intersections between music education, music therapy, and ethnomusicology. As community musician and researcher Lee Higgins explains, the community musician has been identified not as teacher, therapist, social worker, or probation officer, but boundary walker that lies between such professions. And further to this, in traversing the margins, they are in a position of strength. So rather than operating in one field, community musicians kind of operate on the edges, on the margins, in between. And Lee Higgins is arguing that that gives them some strength. They might not be tied to one way of working, for example. They might be able to draw on the positives of different disciplines as they enact their practice. So we're going to look at ethical considerations arising from the role of boundary walker towards the end of this seminar. An important aspect of community music is a welcome to all. So this has been described as an open door policy, and I'll read the quote from Yerichuk and Kra on screen. Many scholars argued that a basic tenet in community music is to welcome everyone, irrespective of music skill or knowledge, what is sometimes called an open door policy, with no auditions. The rationale for music inclusion was most often linked to the idea that everyone deserves music. So I bring this open door policy quote to the seminar because it makes me think about who is welcomed in music education. In your practice, who is welcomed? Who can join, for example? Now, this might be defined by your place of work. So if you're a music teacher in a school, then you might be given a class to work with. So who's in the room is kind of defined by the school, but the way in which you open the door to them engaging in the music learning that you're offering, it can be offered with an open door, a welcome to all. It could be offered in more exclusionary ways. If you're a private instrumental teacher, for example, your door might be open to those that can access or afford the fees. So this open door policy idea really invites us to think about who is included. And in community music, the values and aims underpinning the work include a welcome to all, with the belief that everyone deserves music. Therefore, there's the idea that potentially anyone that wants to can be included. In practice, that's a little bit complicated, and we'll talk about that as we move through this seminar. So the idea that everyone deserves music connects to music participation as a right. So I'll read this quote from Higgins and Willingham. Community music practice is built on the premise that everybody has the right and inherent ability to create and participate in music. There is an emphasis on a variety of musical genres and cultural practices that reflect the uniqueness and/or the diversity of the community makeup. So this really has practical and ethical implications that can be quite complex. If we are working with the idea that everybody has an inherent ability and right to participate, and we open up to many genres and many cultural practices and many different peoples, there's a lot of things to navigate in practice. For example, how can and do community musicians welcome a variety of genres in their work? Is it okay or safe to include genres that may be beyond the facilitator's experience and expertise? What if different members of the group want to make different styles of music? For example, one wants to write a rock tune and another wants to play a folk tune. How do we navigate that? Well, underpinned by a commitment to people, place, participation, inclusion, and diversity, a key strategy in community music to address such ethical complexities and questions is through negotiation and dialogue. So often there'll be a lot of time, asking the group and negotiating with the group, how should we proceed together? And getting the group to talk to each other, how can we navigate that? I know in my practice, I've had improvisations that have included somebody, playing a blues bass line, and others whilst others are playing a more folk kind of melody, and we went into a free improvisation space, and the people in the room thought that was okay and that sounded good. So we progressed in that way. Yeah, negotiation and dialogue are key, and making the space for that, building trust for that. So the idea that people have the right to music participation connects with the United Nations Article 27, which states that everyone has the right to freely participate in the cultural life of the community and to enjoy the arts. And community musicians work from this premise and from a belief that music making and music is a part of being human. And these beliefs and values lead to diverse music practices. So on the screen, there are some examples, and you can see links to these project websites on Moodle. Looking on the top line, the first image, which shows music in prisons at work, shows somebody playing a guitar. We can see their hands on the guitar. We can't see their face. I think there's a neck and a body of another guitar in the foreground, which is obscuring some of the person in the background playing the electric guitar. And music in prisons are part of the Irene Taylor Trust. They run projects in prison, and typically their work might look like 3 facilitators going into a prison for a week, from Monday to Friday, working with a group of people in prison and using that time to create some new material, some new music, to write songs, to make tracks together. And at the end of the week, they might perform the new material to an audience in prison, or they might record it and share the recordings back with the participants after the event, so they've got a tangible memory of it. Going to the next example, we see some people on a stage in front of microphones, and there's one person turning around to look behind them to the rest of the band. Right at the edge, we see somebody clapping, and there's a kind of orange and pink hue lights from the stage. This is the Messengers. The Messengers are a group that work for positive, I think, well-being outcomes, really, and positive experiences and confidence development. And the band, the Messengers, consists of 50% of people that are unhoused or homeless, current or previous experience, and 50% of Guildhall School of Music and Drama students, with about 4 or 5 facilitators. And the bands are typically between 20 to 30 people, and they've had some members that are very long-standing, that have been there for years, and some people that just come to the odd project. They also write new music together, and they perform it to public audiences. Going to the second row, if I go to the first image, showing the example of Hear Me Out, we see what I think is a group of men. Some are playing congas. Right in the corner, there's a djembe. We see somebody, they're kind of in a horseshoe or a semicircle, and in the center is one person playing what I think might be a clarinet or another type of woodwind instrument, and perhaps some singers to the side. Hear Me Out was formerly called Music in Detention, and they work with people seeking asylum and refuge in the UK. Many people seeking asylum and refuge are held in immigration removal centres. They're held in detention settings. And Hear Me Out send facilitators into those settings to make music with the people there. And they might be playing songs from their homeland, or they might be creating new pieces together. One example that I really liked of their practice was a songwriting project where they were writing songs with people in the Immigration Removal Centre, with the asylum seekers and refugees. And then the facilitators would take that material to the local primary schools. So the asylum seekers and refugees cannot leave the Immigration Removal Centre. They stay there. but a way to help them connect with the local community. A very small gesture was the facilitators taking their song to the primary schools. And then the primary school children would add parts to it and, develop the material. And then the facilitators would take it back in to the immigration removal centre, and there'd be this process of back and forth until they created some finished pieces. Now, this was a really nice example of asylum seekers and refugees being able to potentially feel some connection, be heard on the outside in some way, potentially. And the children in the primary schools hearing the perspectives and experiences of those seeking asylum and refuge, potentially. Now, again, as I mentioned, links to these organisations can be found on Moodle. I want to take a moment to explain that whilst I've been talking about community music, you may be familiar with different fields that encompass similar work. For example, socially engaged practice, social arts, artistic citizenship, community music we've talked about, music for social action, which is particularly prominent in Latin America. Outreach, that was a term used more widely, I guess 10, 20 years ago. I think it's still used today. Participatory music making, a term that might be heard in Europe, for example. And these different fields or these different names indicate different and or nuanced underlying philosophical underpinnings, which reflect different inflections or approaches to the work. If you're interested in community and social practice, there are many resources that you can access to learn more. So on the top row here, I've got images of books. The first one being the Oxford Handbook of Community Music. That's a great resource with many chapters from community musicians across the world talking about different aspects of the practice. And then at the very end of that top row, you'll see Dave Camlin's new book called Music Making and Civic Imagination. On the bottom row, we begin with 2 podcasts. So there's in green, the SIM podcast, Social Impact for Music Making podcast, and the Young Musicians in Social Justice podcast. And the next 2 tabs indicate YouTube channels, the International Centre for Community Music and Community Music Learning. And the last image on that bottom row is of the International Journal for Community Music, where you can access lots of articles, and links to all of these can be found on Moodle. As we've been considering applied ethics in this module, one of the last things I want to touch on in this introduction is implications for practice. So with emphasis on inclusive music making that welcomes all, in the UK, many community music practices work from improvisation, collaborative composition, and music invention. And this is underpinned by commitment to self-expression and cultural democracy. And cultural democracy, I think Graves, which is the final quote on this page, has a lovely kind of summing up of that in a nutshell. Graves explains, simply stated, cultural democracy is the notion that everybody's heritage and cultural expression is worthwhile and deserving of an equitable share of whatever resources are available. Art of the people, made by the people, and presented for the people. We'll come back to cultural democracy later. So finally, for practice, community music practice, self-expression and cultural democracy are very important. And therefore, in practice, this means welcoming people with different music experiences, different music interests, a range of technical abilities, a range of instruments, different cultural backgrounds, and different expectations. And as a final point, because you've been looking at learning theories in other seminars, I just wanted to offer this to show that broadly community music sits within a constructivist approach. So I'll read the Higgins and Willingham quote on screen. From a constructivist perspective, music leadership is viewed as a shared process between facilitators and musicians. The organisational structure is flattened and integrated, and participants share common values and purposes. So this is different to traditional models, which, might be more hierarchical, where you have, somebody at the top of that structure making the decisions, calling the shots. Community music seeks to flatten structures, and there's lots of discussion in the field about working towards equality. People talk about leading choir rehearsals in circles so that everybody can feel that they're equally in the space, although we might also problematize that. As we know, ethical considerations is always two or more edges. And yeah, the notion that the facilitator becomes one of the group and wants to work with those and often develops relationships akin to friendships. However, flattening these structures can be easier said than done. I personally would say particularly so within capitalist society and in the context of multiple inequities. But it's an interesting aim, and it's something we're going to talk on a bit more later in the seminar. Okay, let's turn to music is good for you. So much community music practice is built on the notion that music is good for you, underpinned by the belief that music has social, psychological, biological, cognitive, health, and other impacts. For example, social transformations. So this might be peace building, social inclusion, and working towards issues of social justice. Personal transformations. This might be building a person's self-esteem or developing confidence levels or a sense of possible selves. And improved health and well-being outcomes. This could be physical and mental health outcomes. Here are some sources that consider ways in which music is good for you. Again, the links are on Moodle. And I just invite you now to pause for a moment to reflect on what good, if any, you hope to achieve through your practice. So you can pause the seminar. If you want to comment about this in the Padlet, you can. There's a blank kind of tag that says any comments. You can add it in there, and we can pick up on that in tutorial discussions. Yeah, what good, if any, do you hope to achieve through your practice? Okay, take a moment to reflect. Now, to music can be bad for you. So, like many things, it's not quite so simple as saying music is good for you, full stop. Music can also be bad for you. It can harm. So Jeff Baker, for example, has written about the ways in which El Sistema, which is a music organization that grew in Venezuela and now operates in many other countries and claims to use classical music education to rescue vulnerable children. Well, Jeff highlights the ways in which the project has harmed participating young people, including abuses. It's quite political, you can read up online. And Jeff was looking at particularly at El Sistema in Venezuela. That's not to say that all El Sistema projects will operate in harmful ways, potentially, but that it has been identified that a project that's claiming to rescue vulnerable young children or to do good for vulnerable young children has actually caused harm and abuse. Sally-Ann Green and George Musgrave explore the question, can music make you sick? So in their book, Can Music Make You Sick? They highlight music's toll on musicians and how careers based on an all-consuming passion have become more insecure and devalued. And they write particularly in reference to the music industry and popular music genres. And in January of this year, the UK government's Women and Equalities Committee published a report titled Misogyny in Music, highlighting the ways in which women and gender diverse people are harmed by the music industry and music education. These sources invite us to consider the question, if music can be bad for you, in what ways might your practice harm? In what ways might my practice harm? It's something I'm thinking about. And how can those harms be mitigated? I think this is a really important question. Even if we intend to do good, we can't assume that we'll always do good, myself included. And I invite you to reflect on this. Again, you can jot comments down in the Padlet, in the any other comments section. Also, if you work in teams with other people, so if you work with other colleagues, I invite you to take this question to them and to reflect on it together. And I've included these two slides, music is good for you and music can be bad for you, because reflection on the ways in which music can do good or can harm is important for community musicians, especially so since a key aim of their practice is to work towards positive change. So if you're hoping to do good through your music education practice, I think it's really important to interrogate, and reflect on the ways in which you might not do that. Okay, let's move to some ethical considerations in community music that overlap with ethical considerations in music education. I'm also going to note that I've asked loads of big questions today, and it's really to get our conversations flowing, and we won't have definitive answers. The answers will be dependent on the context, on the situation, but really doing the work and reflecting on these very difficult questions will enrich your practice. It will just, it's really important because you're working with people. It will enrich it, and you will inevitably, be learning and growing through that. So stick with me. Now, in the interests of time, I'm going to touch on 3 examples. There are, of course, many others. So let's start with inclusion and inclusivity. With the principles of an open door policy, welcome to all, and music participation as a human right, this is an important issue for community music. And indeed, there's many community musicians that have written on inclusion and inclusivity. A number of the sources that Tim presented in his ethical considerations and special educational needs and disabilities seminar for this module, for example, they were written by community musicians. So we saw things by Phil Mullen, for example, Graham Dowdall. In an article titled From Inclusion to Inclusivity, a scoping review of community music scholarship, Deanna Yerichuk and Justice Krah present frameworks for inclusion. So these include those that they identify as being musically inclusive strategies. These are the strategies in the green box, and I'll just read those out. So musically inclusive strategies may include no auditions, no requirements of previous skill or experience, multiple ways of participating in the music, flexible structures to engage in music, a diverse range of musical repertoires, and multiple ways to process, multiple processes of music making. In the purple box, they identify strategies for social inclusion, and these include recognizing social systems that may affect musical participation. Think about your learners, think about your students. What might impact how they join you in the space? Recognizing social barriers to participation, creating socially safe spaces for participation. And I know in the Saturday tutorial group, we've had lots of discussions where people have talked about the importance of developing a relationship and a rapport with their students to make it feel like there's a trust and a bond so you can work well together. And finally, addressing systems of oppression through community music. Yerichuk and Krah, whilst highlighting those strategies, they also identified that with community music, inclusion was often normatively invoked, with no definition or approaches provided, and that community music scholarship may benefit from more sustained and deliberate use of the term inclusivity. So that should be from a more, sustained and deliberate use of the term inclusivity, which points to the ongoing practice and effort towards inclusion. So they're really saying that more work needs to be done for a better understanding of what counts as inclusivity. So lots of people might say, oh yeah, I'm an inclusive practitioner. Inclusion is important for me. I aim to include, but they're not really very clear or explicit on what that means or how they do it. Also, note that they're using the term inclusivity rather than inclusion. So the article is typed from inclusion to inclusivity, and that is to show that to strive towards being inclusive is an ongoing effort. So in terms of overlaps between ethical considerations in community music and music education, there are some core questions to develop inclusivity. For example, what does it mean to include? When might inclusion be exclusionary? Can moving from inclusion to inclusivity support more inclusive practices? The next ethical consideration I want to touch on is the question of whose music. So what repertoires are we working with? What styles, what forms, what music are we including in our practice? Janet talked about this in her presentation titled Ethical Considerations, Cultures and Contexts. And I suspect that this idea of whose music is a question that will come up in the forthcoming seminar on diversity, equity and inclusion that will be live on this module soon. In community music, guided by the values of cultural democracy, this question can be navigated in practice through activities such as improvisation or collaborative composition. So by inviting participants to improvise or create their own music, there's the possibility for them to decide which music is included. However, that doesn't mean the question of whose music is resolved. It's an ongoing question, like many, if not all, of the ethical considerations that we're discussing. These questions are ongoing. We have to keep thinking and revisiting on them. In community music, as facilitators or music leaders plan activities, games, and warm-ups for workshops, for example, they are active in deciding what music and how to music. There's also the potential, and I'll talk about this from my practice, where when you're trying as a leader to bring together cohesive pieces with diverse groups, especially if you've got a performance deadline or a deadline for an outcome of some kind, then the room for negotiation is diminished. And the facilitator can inadvertently make music for those they had intended to make music with. So in my practice, I had 60 children one time, and we had to work so quickly that I might take the suggestions that come first, meaning that those that might take more time or be less confident or less able to engage in my mode of doing were left out. And I might have pushed and quickly, put down some chords and written a lyric to get us to actually produce something together. But by doing that, I'm really just doing the composition. The collaborative nature of it is minimal. So I find returning to the question of whose music is really important. And I find Juliet Hess's work helpful here. So I'll read Juliet Hess's quote. If every child can do music, whose music do we mean? Which traditions? Which instruments? We must continue to ask who is not present in our classes, our programs, our curriculum, our pedagogy. And finally, whilst community music strives to flatten structures, in its wanting for equal spaces or equality, issues of power still remain. In this practice, facilitators are paid, participants aren't. Facilitators have a responsibility to those they work with. So whilst equality, cultural democracy, and inclusivity are strived for, it remains important to consider questions such as who makes decisions in the practice? To what extent do participants have agency? We might say, to what extent do your students have agency? To what extent do participants have ownership? How does what we say about the practice align with what we do in practice? And finally, I'll discuss one ethical issue that is significant to community music as an informal, non-formal practice, as a practice between the margins of teaching and learning, healthcare, music therapy, for example, social services, and so forth, which positions the musician as boundary walkers. So for those of you that work in a music education setting, if you're teaching music in a school, for example, you'll have policies and procedures that guide your work. You'll also have a team or people that you can report to share information if there's safeguarding concerns, for example. And Janet talked about this in her seminar titled Ethical Considerations and Relationships in Teaching and Learning. However, community musicians don't often have this because they're boundary walkers. They often work alone, and because of the structures of the way in which community music operates in the UK, they work alone, often on short-term projects or one-off visits, and they exist outside of formal structures. So whilst they might be a visitor to a school, a hospital, or a prison, for example, they're not an employee of those formal institutions or organisations. For example, in the UK, whilst there are practitioner codes of practice, and I've got a couple of examples here, Music Leader and Sound Sense, and Catherine Dean, who was the leader of Sound Sense previously, and organisations might have their own policies. These are not statutory requirements. The community musician is not legally required to follow a code of practice, for example. And therefore, there's some possibility there that they've got flexibility and agency in some senses to do things differently. But also there's challenge, particularly when working in diverse, non-formal and informal contexts. There's often not the infrastructure or clear route for implementation. So if I was working in a community setting, for example, and leading an improvisation in a park, if something happened there and a child disclosed an issue, I'd find it difficult to know who I report that to or to support them through that issue. And I think that's a real challenge for community musicians. So it's great to be on the margins, on the fringes, but to what extent might we need some codes of practice? I'm not sure. I'm working that one out. Okay, so I'm going to bring this question to you. We can work it out together and we can consider it in your tutorials. So the questions I'd like you to consider in your tutorials are, what are the possibilities and limits of working in music outside formal structures? Do musicians working in this way need codes of practice? Question number 2. What values, beliefs, and aims guide your practice? What is important to you? And we will go to the Padlet in your tutorial to see what responses we have. And question number 3. What do you consider to be good or right in music education? What does good or right look, feel, or sound like in your practice? What helps you to achieve this? What hinders this? So there's lots of questions there. Do take time to engage with them. Like I said, this is really complex work and it takes a lot of effort and energy, but it's very much worthwhile. Um, I've got the references here, and there's going to be the links to the other resources on Moodle. And just finally to say thank you so much for listening. And if you have any questions, you can email me at j.gibson@trinitylaban.ac.uk. Thank you very much.